Good morning, guys. Good morning. It's Brother Ramon. Doing a follow-up video to the last video I put up, the T in tulip. This one's going to be covering the U, which stands for unconditional election. And just to start off, I just want to say, that I truly believe this is one of the worst, if not the worst, doctrine that the Reformed Church holds to. And when I say Reformed Church, I'm referring to Calvinists, people who hold to the Calvinist doctrines. The U in the tulip, unconditional election, it stands for, or it actually argues that before the world began, God chose not only who would be saved, but also he chose who would be lost. There was an arbitrary choosing on the behalf of God, and this is not a corporate choosing. This also is not according to his foreknowledge. This was him saying, this individual is going to be saved here, this individual is going to be lost here. That is exactly what Calvinists teach. They won't argue that they believe that. Some Calvinists would say that they don't believe in what they call double predestination. But I think we're all smart enough to understand that if you choose certain individuals to be saved, you're pretty much choosing other individuals to be lost. You understand what I'm saying? So the idea that God, as the scripture says, desires all men to be saved does not sit well with the Calvinists. They have to argue that he desires all of his elect to be saved. And this doctrine of unconditional election, and it's exactly, what it says. It's unconditional. There's nothing, no rhyme or reason to it really, other than for God's glory, they argue. God chose who would be damned for his glory. He chose who would be elect for his glory. So one of the things I do want to point out is that the scriptures do teach both doctrines. They just don't teach them in the Calvinistic way. The scriptures teach that there's a doctrine of election and a doctrine of predestination. What we have to do is go to the scriptures to see how the scriptures actually teach those things, right? We can't argue on one hand that God chose people for salvation, individual people, because I do believe there's a such thing as corporate election. I honestly do believe that. But that he chose individual people for salvation, but he did not choose individual people for damnation. And the reason that's so important is because when you're preaching the gospel to people, or if you're trying to teach anyone about the gospel, and you have in your mind that 90% of mankind, I'm just throwing out a rough number, but 90% of mankind is going to go to the lake of fire, and it's only because God chose for them to. You're going to have this conflict. I'm preaching to a guy who most likely not only cannot hear the gospel, but will not hear it because God is withholding his ability to hear it. And if you talk with Calvinists long enough, they will argue that. They will argue that if someone does not hear, it's because God is not giving them the faith. He's not giving them the ability to hear and understand the gospel message. Some Calvinists will argue that these points are exaggerated, or we're misrepresenting their arguments. But all you have to do is talk to one for any length of time and ask the right questions, and you'll see that this is exactly what they believe. If God actually is responsible for individuals being lost, then we can't really blame people, for their actions, their deeds, for their denial of the gospel. If God chose before these people ever existed, you're going to be lost. And again, I stress, they do not teach this as according to God's foreknowledge. They actually mock the idea that God looked into the future, see who was going to reject his message, and elected them for damnation. The Calvinists do not teach that. They teach that God had everyone in his hands on equal terms, and for no reason at all say heaven, hell, heaven, hell, heaven, hell. Unconditional election, right? Only for my glory, right? These children who are born have no hope of salvation. That's for my glory. So people who ask me at times why I do not like the Calvinist doctrine, it's not so much about me not liking it. I do dislike it, but it's more about what it implies. Like if you were to sit down and really think about what the implications are of these doctrines, as Calvin taught that whatsoever things come to pass by the preordained or the decree of God. When you think about the implications of such a thing, you start to understand why the God of Calvinism cannot be the God of the Bible. They actually place all the blame of everything that goes on. They say they're giving God credit, right? But we know if you go and murder someone, we don't use the term credit, right? It's called blame. You get the blame for murdering someone. And that's exactly what the Calvinists do. They change up language. They hijack biblical language and turn it into something that it's not. We give God credit for all things. But ask a Calvinist, do you give God credit when you sin? All of a sudden, no, that's all me. So God didn't preordain your sin, and watch him dance. So in the end, the total depravity doctrine actually demands this unconditional election. And the reason being is, if all men were created, I'm sorry. Didn't realize it was garbage day. So what I was saying is that if all men are created equally sinful from nature, there has to be some kind of arbitrary choice that God made to save all men. Because remember, total depravity, teaches that men cannot do anything good, not even believe, without having first been regenerated. And you ask, okay, who's regenerated? And the Calvinists have your answer. Well, the ones God chose would be regenerated, right? And it all comes back to circular reasoning with these guys. But yeah, go and check it out. If there's anything I've said wrong in the video that is misrepresented, bring it back to me, and we'll talk about it. But I think I faithfully represented what Calvinists actually teach concerning not only total depravity up to this point, but also unconditional election. The idea that God chooses who's going to be saved and who's going to be lost for no good reason at all other than for his glory. God bless you guys.